Welcome to the Everyday PM podcast, the podcast where we discuss project management principles for your everyday life. My name is Campea, and I'm the host and founder of the Everyday PM. And I'm so excited to welcome our very special guest, Leslie Grandy, who is here to speak about future-proofing business success with generative AI. I love that because, as everybody knows, AI is everywhere. Everyone's trying to learn about it, catch up on it. And Leslie is here to break it down for us in that space. So Leslie, for those who have not met you yet, please take a brief moment to introduce yourself to our audience.
Sure. Thanks for having me, and I'm happy to be here. I've had over a 2-decade career in product management dating back to early streaming media days in the early days of the internet. And I've led product teams that have included designers, program managers, product managers, and engineers for companies like Apple, Amazon, T-Mobile, Best Buy, and Discovery. And after I retired from full-time work, I wrote a book called Creative Velocity, Propelling Breakthrough Ideas in the Age of Generative AI. And the platform is really to help people as AI is sort of taking on more mundane tasks to explore their creativity, to understand what they bring to that partnership, and to actually create space with the thanks to AI for that kind of strategic and creative thinking.
That's incredible. Your background is truly amazing. And I'm sure from all of those companies, big and small, that you've been able to work with, you've learned a lot about how generative AI might fit into that business model. So I'm curious, even before I get into my first question for you, what was that moment for you where you decided, you know what, let me write this into something that can be useful for others to learn from? And so, as you had mentioned, you wrote the book. Was there something that happened in your professional journey that you said, I gotta go down this path, I gotta share my thoughts on this topic?
It's a really interesting question because the answer is a little bit of a bunch of things as opposed to one real aha moment. One of them is one of the main drivers for the topic. Before I get into sort of writing the book and delivering the book, is over the years of coaching people as a leader of teams, I see people more than I'd like to hold back because they don't think it's their role to contribute a
Mm,
creative idea, or that in their job they're expected to be executional. And so therefore
yeah.
they don't leave space to solve problems creatively. And it's frustrating because some of the most talented people that I have, and when I say that in their job they're talented, are the least comfortable in that space of expressing themselves creatively.
Yeah.
And so when I would hire people, I started to really look for signals that they might not be that type of person, that they might actually be the type of person that sees the world from multiple perspectives or has great empathy to be
Hmm.
able to adapt a new perspective. And so those skills started to become more important in the teams that I hired. So that's kind of the topic for me
Yeah. Yeah.
area. And I have a lot of a passion about it because people get judged on performance as to whether they can think big when they want to move up in their career. But a
Yeah.
lot of people don't feel they have permission in their job to think big. And so
Wow.
I want to help people sort of own that, take agency over it. The second part and the second kind of factor here is my fear that AI takes that away from people, that they
Hmm.
feel that AI is more creative, more capable of generating ideas quickly, more useful in that way. And so not just outsourcing for productivity tasks, but outsourcing thinking. That's a real concern for me because these people who are already vulnerable to not thinking they're creative are probably the first class of people that will flock to AI to generate ideas for them. And it's
Yeah.
not that AI shouldn't do that, but you should have agency over it. And the only way you have agency is to believe you can be creative and take that output and mold it into something purposeful and meaningful and valuable. So
Mhm.
I think those are the two kind of factors in why the topic. The book, why the book, and why, how did that all convert into a book? When I left full-time work, I wasn't really sure what I was going to do with my time. And my husband kept saying, "Oh, you should write a book and you should write a book." And I kept thinking, I don't need to do it for myself, but if there's value in doing it,
Yeah.
if there's an audience for it, maybe then I will. And part of my product training was to actually look at the construct of writing a book like I was launching a product, and
Oh.
putting the sort of topics into a book proposal that I gave to a bunch of people who were not family, but who would give me tough love, who would tell me,
Mm-hmm.
oh, this is cute. It's a blog post, not a book.
Mm-hmm.
Or,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
who do you think's going to read this? Why would somebody care? And so I kept looking for that kind of negative feedback. And this is kind of play into our discussion, which is why I felt it's important to kind of go down this journey. I wanted somebody to tell me it was a bad idea. And I
Yeah.
wanted to understand why it was a bad idea. And I wanted to
Yes.
understand what I missed, right? And so looking for the negative feedback was actually the most positive thing because everybody made it better. And everybody told me where I could strengthen it or how I can. So 6 months in, I gave the proposal to someone who was an author with Wiley, very successful author, and I knew that person wouldn't like want me to do it, embarrass myself. And so he would tell me this is a
Yeah.
bad idea.
Yeah.
Um, and he said, how are you going to sell the book? And I said, well, I figured I'll do it the way they say on the website. He said, that'll never happen. He said, if I like the book, I'll pitch it to my editor. And if she's interested in reading the proposal, I'll introduce you to her. And so by the time I got to that point, the product had sort of gone through all that user testing and all of the
Mm-hmm.
things that would help me see. I asked professors at the University of Washington, I asked all sorts of people to read the book to see if it had value. And by the time I got to this person, it was very easy for him to introduce me to his publisher because it had already been formulated and I had
Mm-hmm.
already taken all of the risk out of it, if you will, in
Yeah.
how it showed up. And within a week, they bought the book. So I
Wow.
realized I was never going to do it just to self-publish to fulfill some personal need or ego need. I really wanted to actually get it to people and to help people. And so getting the publisher validation was the real final moment of saying, okay, this is a thing I should probably go write.
That was brilliant, insightful, and I love the connective tissue between what you have done professionally for over 2 decades and how you're able to apply kind of that same framework into getting to this place with the book. That's incredible, Leslie. I love that. So, I mean, why don't we dive into creative velocity now? Obviously you've launched all kinds of projects for these multi-billion-dollar companies. You've seen these be either successes or failures. Now, in your book, you argue that one of our biggest mistakes strategically is planning failures, and how psychologically unwilling we are as humans to admit weakness and plan for those failure type scenarios, right? We always want to just say, this is going to be successful. We hardly ever have those conversations
Right,
around what if it fails and what does that mean? I don't know what that is about the human being, in our nature to do that, but typically the conversations I've even sat in are always about this is going to be successful. No one's in the room
right,
saying, well, what's the flip side of that coin? So,
right.
can you share a story maybe from one of those companies, or it can just be kind of a trend or an overview of what you've seen throughout your professional journey where you saw this play out? And, where a team's inability to imagine failure led to something that probably could have been preventable.
Yeah, there's a couple of nuggets in there. So the first thing I'll say is, I think there is a, a predisposition to avoid the negative,
Hmm.
right? So that's just in general in failure being negative. So when we present an idea in a meeting to stakeholders or executives, um, if we get the objection, sometimes we get defensive. And so we don't actually get at the root of what the objection
Yeah.
is. And
Hmm.
even if the objection may be flawed, the fact that there's someone there that could create a reason for us to fail is something we also navigate around. Like, oh, John is just a negatron and he doesn't like anything we do that isn't his idea. So we're just going to avoid talking to John. Right? That's a
Right.
very common behavior. We kind of cut the people out who might create the friction because we really feel the pressure to deliver. And so
Hmm.
within an organization, there's a pattern that develops where we don't take the objection as an opportunity to improve the idea or to strengthen the idea. We don't look at the objection as something that's meant to be supportive of the idea innately. And so
Hmm.
we're move into a position where we deal with that objection in one of three ways. Maybe we go deeper and maybe we learn what is the source of that objection and address it either in our a delivery plan or in our feature prioritization, right? Maybe that's one thing that we could do. But maybe there's a cultural propensity to just avoid conflict. And so, in a lot of consensus driven organizations, people will navigate around the conflict.
Yeah.
And that's number two, right? You can see where I'm not going to be able to have a healthy conversation with somebody about their objective, so I'll just navigate around it.
Hmm.
And then the third thing that we do when we see this in this kind of organizational tendency is that we look at the reason for failure as potentially um, not worthy of our time. Like we
Hmm.
don't dive into what that failure case would be or what would have caused it. And so we're more willing to look at that in retrospective in a postmortem,
Yeah.
right? And so we spend the time evaluating what went wrong after it went wrong, but we rarely do the premortems to think if we failed like this, what would have happened to make us fail? And that's a
Hmm.
behavioral um, miss for most product teams, right? We don't see it as an agile ceremony like postmortems are and retrospectives are. We don't go in front expecting to fail. We want to show our confidence to our teams, to our leaders, and so we don't really spend the time exploring the failure cases. Sometimes, and this is again another risk to not doing that, the failure case you might decide is one in a million, but if it happens, your business shuts down,
Yeah.
right? So when we think about things that have happened over the last year where certain data systems and network security systems aren't available to regular everyday businesses, they counted on those companies to deliver that. What did they plan for if they didn't?
Hmm.
Maybe it's once in a blue moon that will happen, but now your business isn't operating online anymore for until they figure out what happened. And so
Hmm.
you are so in failure mode that you don't actually have anything you can do to recover. There is no
Yeah.
backstop.
Yeah.
So I think those are the reasons and the trends that I think that describe what you see around the negativity. In particular, I think there's also a reticence for people at a company to um, object in any way to something that maybe a higher authority has proposed. But you're
Hmm.
closer to the ground, you're clearer about what could go wrong. And it's hard in a meeting to tell Steve Jobs, that's a dumb idea, right?
Yeah.
I
Right.
or that idea will fail for this reason. Even if you don't
Hmm.
say it in a silly critical way like it's a dumb idea, you say, here's reasons I don't think that will work. It's hard to be the one that speaks up in that meeting,
Right.
right? And so authority, and I saw that happen when I was at Apple during the Steve Jobs era. Steve wanted to launch an iPod speaker that looked like a lunchbox cooler. It was big and looked nothing. The only thing about it that looked Apple-like was that it was white. And there wasn't a single person in a meeting without Steve who would say it was going to sell. But
Hmm.
nobody in a meeting with Steve would tell him.
Uh-huh.
And he wouldn't have heard anyway. He wouldn't have listened. So they just all shut down. And sure enough, not many people remember that product ever released, right? It failed. But it
Yeah.
was, in his case, something he could just pull out of distribution quickly and it faded from memory because of the number of successes. But nobody in the room wanted to say to that authority, this is not a good idea. This is not
Yeah.
going to sell.
Yeah.
It's going to take up shelf space because of the size. It's going to be hard to carry because it's so cumbersome. Like all the reasons it might not have worked because he had more hits than misses. So people were like, maybe he does know better. And so sometimes failure happens because of a case where the authority of the idea and the person that delivered it feels like it's irrefutable.
Hmm. Yeah. Understood. And in those situations, Leslie, where there's kind of a subtle trend in what you've discussed so far around somebody kind of losing that agency or that permission to have a say. And when we're looking at the potential failures, obviously you called out the human behavior is to immediately try to justify the successes before you even think about that. How have you navigated that in terms of being a leader in the room, knowing, let's say, in this speaker conversation that we're talking about, this speaker that never launched this product at Apple, um, that it probably wasn't the best decision. How do you provide that feedback? I guess I'm speaking on behalf of the project managers who are probably listening to this saying, I've been in the room, I've used the data, I've tried to talk about what this looks like from a failure standpoint, yet it didn't feel like anyone was listening to me. Is there anything at that point you would advise product managers, project managers in terms of what you've seen be effective in that type of situation?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different techniques, but one really simple one is to take it out of the personal and the judgmental and to say, what if this doesn't happen the way you imagine it would?
Mm.
What could be the things that would go wrong that prevents it? Is it customer behavior? Is it distribution problems? Like, what are the things? So let's think about if one of those things doesn't go as we expect. And then it's not so much you were wrong or your predictions are as possible, maybe as mine are, but what happens if both of us aren't right? Like, what's
Yeah.
that scenario? Right. So
Yeah.
it's not so much about being the right person in the room or the critical person in the room, but asking a what if question that takes it out of the personal and creates that sort of, well, what if we're all wrong about how customers are going to react to this?
Mm-hmm.
What would that look like? What could be what could be the trigger of that? Have we thought about what might be something we have to plan for since nobody's ever seen this kind of speaker before? What
Mm-hmm.
might be the questions or problems, right, that it
Yeah.
raises in distribution, or what might be the shipping issues, or, what have we not asked about as a place where we could be vulnerable, even if what we're right is that there's a need for this and we think it will fit the market need.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There are circumstances that are not always in our control, and that's the way you help bridge the conversation. The
Yeah.
circumstances that you can't control are things like customer behavior.
Right.
You cannot just, you don't know also what could happen the day you launch in terms of some tragic event that the whole world is focused on. There could be some other scenario where what you planned isn't in your control, and what happens, therefore, isn't what you planned.
Yeah.
And so there's a great saying that says, by not planning to fail, you will fail,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because the idea that failing to plan creates the case for failure.
Yeah,
And so
absolutely.
I think it's the notion that there's things you can't control that are beyond your knowledge, especially if you're an innovator like Steve Jobs. There are things you won't know that
Mm-hmm.
people will do because they won't tell you in advance because they've not seen that before.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so
Good
that's
point.
the most important time to say, well, what if we were wrong about what customers will do? Or what if our assumptions are wrong? Which assumptions would hurt us the most if we are wrong? And
Yeah.
by asking it that way, you're sort of putting it on the table and letting
Yeah.
anybody comment about it without it being a personal thing. And you do it in the light of fortifying the plan, because if we think about these things in advance, we'll have contingencies for them. We won't be unprepared when they happen to activate the contingency.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that insight, by the way. I think it gives us a little bit of a deeper layer and insight into how you would navigate that situation. And now I want to take that similar scenario and pile on there, Leslie, generative AI, right? In
Yep.
terms of your insights into generative AI. I know right now a lot of organizations are looking at it from an operational efficiency standpoint. How do we draft emails faster? How do we generate reports with automation? I know in your book, you coined the phrase strategic imagination in terms of repositioning how folks are looking at generative AI and the usage of that more
Yep.
as like a creative partner rather
Right.
than just kind
Right.
of doing the thinking for us in many
Yep.
ways. So could you walk us through what that practice looks like in practice and how is that differentiating from kind of at a basic level what I've seen organizations looking at AI for right now to do, which is like those basic automated tasks, that operational efficiency that I described?
Yeah, so the thing that's so great about AI is that it can do pattern recognition faster than the human brain. So if this circumstance looks like any other circumstance in any other domain, it can use that to fuel possible places where there are vulnerabilities in your plan.
Mm,
People who've tried to do something like this before in other fields have seen this happen, right? So there's
yeah.
the ability to look quickly across similar but not related domains, similar situations. So a good example of this is I create a disruptive check-in process. Now let me look at what happens when people try to disrupt the check-in process across all the places people check in
Yeah.
restaurants, in hotels, in airports, right? The notion that there's a different kind of experience every place you go that's unique to that experience might tell you something,
Hmm.
right? Like, what are they solving for in that unique experience? The experience is similar, it's a check in, but there are consequences that are different, right? And so you want that assistance in terms of seeing what people have done where there isn't necessarily data about what you're doing, but the domain may be serviced by knowledge from other places. A really great example of this is um, you're getting into the defense segment, and one of the things that
Mhm.
defense has really done great is at looking at nature and bioscience for how things actually work in nature.
Yeah,
So drone swarming is by what happens when insects swarm to attack, right? And if you look at
right.
certain things, you can actually see what happens and what goes wrong when that happens. And so now you can say, all right, I can see why it has benefit, but I also see where it has vulnerability. So let me go fix that in this sort of re-evolution of nature and what I'm going to build. So that ability to look in places you're not uniquely familiar with, you don't know yourself, that's a really great way to sort of offset some potential risk. The
Hmm.
other great way that AI works is that it can quickly look at second and third level consequences of a miss. What if this assumption is wrong? What are the ripple effects of that assumption being wrong in places I might not look? Right? I
Yeah,
might be focused more on the operational, but there could be brand ramifications for this miss. And
right.
I might focus only on the operational ones. And so the idea that it can look at the second and third level consequences quickly to help make sure that sometimes the first one isn't the biggest hit. It's what happens when the second and third get activated, right? And
Right,
then in
right.
totality, it's a crash, right? It's a
Yeah,
problem.
yep.
And so you want to have that ability to get to that level of thinking quickly as well. And I think that's a really useful way that generative AI can bring you back the kinds of questions. Well, have you thought about this, or what about this, or where are the other areas? Lastly, I think it's hard to know what the opposite of an assumption could create. We assume people will do this. We assume the market will be like that. We assume the tolerance for prices in this range, and we make a lot of assumptions especially in innovation, without a lot of data. And even when we have data, data isn't always predictive of what happens in a new environment. And so being able to provide a list of assumptions and look at the opposite of those assumptions being true and what they do to the plan. Here's my plan. Here are the assumptions underlying that plan. Now, what if any of these assumptions was wrong? What would be the consequence of that on my plan?
Right.
And so now you're able to sort of take all that insight quickly, right? And establish where you, with the agency that you have, want to focus, go deeper, understand how to build a contingency plan. So it's going to come back with all this perspective, but the human has to sort of put value on what's the most important thing to focus on, what's the one to explore, and what risk you want to tolerate.
Yeah. I'm smiling because all these, little light bulbs are going off in my head as you're speaking because,
Right.
we just talked about a few minutes earlier how just the human nature, the human behavior around being not in the position to want to discuss failure. And then now you've laid out kind of the layer of this is what you would do situationally if you were in the room. And then now we've added in the layer of how do you then make generative AI your creative partner in this journey. And then now I'm thinking, I wonder if, Leslie, you would imagine a space, or maybe you've already seen it, where folks are in a room using the data from the prompts that they've fed into the generative AI tool and are now leveraging that kind of to placate the adverse nature that humans have to talk about the negative. Have you seen anyone surface Gen AI as if they were another stakeholder in the room and
Well,
saying they are
it's
the
a
ones talking about failure?
No, it's really a great question. I haven't seen it, but what I have talked to several product managers about is using that as a uh, talking points sort of memo for the conversation. So I hear
Yeah.
your objection, and I've explored it with AI. And
Uh-huh.
here's some thoughts that I have now in thinking about that objection. So it does two things. One is it gives the person I've been seen and heard, which from a stakeholder perspective or a leader perspective is valuable, right, to do.
Absolutely.
It shows you took them seriously. It also shows that you did it dispassionately and not defensively, because the psychological distance that generative AI brings is really
Hmm.
helpful in that conversation, right? It's not saying bad idea. It's saying here's some flaws, here's some risks, here's some
Yeah.
assumptions that aren't strong, right? And so it takes that human dialogue from I think this is not the way to go, to let's explore the reasons this could go wrong and
Yeah.
see how realistic we think they are together. And by the way, I have contingency plans for 3 out of the 5 of them.
Mm-hmm. It's
And
brilliant.
now
It's brilliant.
now as a product person, you're again, you're showing a level of insight that isn't just your personal knowledge because maybe you're a more junior employer, you don't have the years of experience of the person who's provided the objection.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Gosh, Leslie, I'm gonna try to prevent myself from rabbit holing down this trend, but I'm absolutely enjoying this conversation. But to kind of put the bow on this conversation around your book, Creative Velocity, as well as the insights that you bring within the context of that. Uh, let's talk a little bit about big picture. So building that organizational resilience, making sure that it's not just for example, individual project managers who are usually the audience of the Everyday PM, but product managers, whomever, that it goes from individual to organizational practice.
Yeah.
So you talk about, I think the term is premeditation of evils with Gen AI, which can help in terms of organizational cultural change and that sort of thing. So can you elaborate more on what you mean by that, and then as well as what do you think it's going to take to build that type of resilience at scale?
So the premeditation of evils is a Stoic philosophy, and one of the reasons that Stoicism factors in here, and I talk about this in the book as well, is because the Stoics are really about emotional regulation, right? And not having the highs and lows that come from, failures and wins, right?
Hmm.
And taking them all in stride and then being able to process them all with equanimity. And in an organization that accepts failure, that equanimity is part of how they do it, right? People don't
Hmm.
get punished for it and any more than they get rewarded only when they celebrate. And I was talking to an executive yesterday who was telling me that in his all hands meetings, he starts with all the failures and what we've learned from them. So that
Nice.
people doesn't, it's not that he's celebrating failure, it's that he's acknowledging it
Yeah.
as a part of the journey.
Yeah.
And so that acceptance of the learning from it comes from being regulated in how you react to it. So that's part of why the Stoics are really good for this
Hmm.
advice, right? Because we all fear failure as a performance judgment, and we all
Yeah.
feel fear failure as a final statement as opposed to a learning journey. So that's one element of it. The premeditation of evils is also based on the Stoic belief that things that you don't think about or don't plan for hit you harder. If you not so much expect the worst, worried is just to worry, but if you imagine these things could happen, you build more robust and resilient plans because you expect the things that are out of your control could go wrong. And so you think about the ideas in advance of what it would take if they did. And so there's
Hmm.
kind of 3 components to this in the book that I use to sort of bring it to life. The first is paradoxical thinking. What if one of your assumptions is true, but the opposite is also true?
Hmm.
Both things can be true, creates a different dynamic than if only yours is true,
Right.
right? There's a tension in both things being true, which isn't bad always. Look at Bombas as profitable and charitable, right? Those
Yeah.
typically don't exist. So it's not bad. But if you understand what it creates when both of those exist, the assumption that you have and its opposite can coexist, you're a little more prepared for what that dynamic will be when you enter the market or you execute the plan,
Yeah.
right? Because then it doesn't torpedo you that someone said, well, see, the opposite is true. Yeah, but I'm true too. And in that scenario, this is how we have to navigate that tension, right? So it's
Hmm.
a proactive thought about that. The second one is opposite thinking. And I love to recall the Seinfeld episode with George Costanza, where he spent the whole day doing the opposite of every single thing he thought about
I
doing.
take all and any Seinfeld references. Thank you,
Perfect. Because
Leslie.
that episode was so fantastic. And when they interviewed the actor who played him, Jason Alexander said that people have walked up to him on the street telling them that they took that advice and it worked out for the better. And
Wow.
the whole concept of this is imagining every assumption is wrong, that everything that you assume to be true isn't in the plan, isn't what's going to be true. And by taking the opposite of your assumptions, not that yours is true, but only the opposite is true. Now you
Hmm.
recognize how it weakens the plan. Can the plan go forward if one of these assumptions isn't true? Which assumption not being true will hurt the plan the most? Right. And so by looking at the opposite of your assumptions, you're looking at the ways that things along the way could decrement your success. Maybe it'll be successful, but maybe not as successful. Or maybe it can't be successful if this assumption is wrong. And so you kind of rank your assumptions and you see the risk in your assumptions more clearly that way.
Yeah.
And then the last version of this is called inversion thinking. And this is where you actually imagine the worst thing that could happen is the opposite of what you want to happen. And I'll tell a personal story on this. My first career was in the film industry. I was a film major at Northwestern and I grew up in Philadelphia and I wanted to move to LA right away after college and start working in the film industry. I had no friends, no relatives, no connections, no idea how to do it. And my parents, who were educated professionals, told me it was a dumb idea and that I would fail. They were 100% sure. They didn't support this idea. And when I left, they're like, good luck, right? Like, we're not helping you because we think this is a bad idea. You made this choice. Go live with it.
Right.
The entire time I was in LA, I thought they can't be right. I can't let them be right because if they're right, then everything I want is wrong. And
Yeah.
I can't believe that. So, what is it going to take for me not to fail? How do I look at their scenario and what would prove them right? Well, I couldn't pay my rent, would prove them right. I couldn't afford my car because LA is a car city. You have to have a
Hmm.
car, right? I couldn't sustain long enough to build a career economically. Not that I couldn't find a job in the film industry. And if I reset that failure state at that abstract level, which is maybe it takes a year or two to get into the film industry, and I just have to buy my time and make smart choices along the way, then they won't be right because I'll have survived long enough to do that. And that actually was the biggest motivation. And within 3 years, I became a member of the Directors Guild of America. I ended up working with James Cameron and Brian De Palma, and I literally had no prior connections. I was not a Nepo baby. I
Incredible.
didn't know anyone. But I
Yeah.
navigated my way there with a different point of view because I didn't set out thinking that was the job I had to have. I just thought I needed money. And in
Yeah.
LA, if you work on as a cater waiter or a nanny, you're probably working for people in the industry,
Right.
right? And so putting myself out there to get jobs, even if they weren't the job, helped me make my network. And then in building my network, I was able then, right, to navigate to an entry level job where someone knew me and trusted my basic intelligence and skills to give me that entry level production assistant job. And then once I got that door open, it was up to me to keep working. But I started to appreciate that the effort to get in there was all mine, not to get the final job,
Hmm.
right? But to put myself in a position to get hired.
Yeah.
And so that failure was the biggest motivation to not failing. And my
Yeah.
parents just couldn't believe it. Like they wouldn't believe that I actually had success. And when they asked, I said, it's because I just didn't want you to be right. I just didn't want you. And so I thought of every possible way that you could be right. And I did the opposite of that. I thought about what it would be that I would have to do so that that wouldn't happen. And so my plan was super strong and super resilient. And in retrospect, probably the only plan that would have worked.
Yeah, absolutely. Leslie, that story alone has been incredibly inspiring and has been transformative just for me. So if I'm being selfish amongst my audience, I've enjoyed this conversation thoroughly
It's great.
because now you have me thinking about things in a very different framework and light. And that's what I wanted for us to get together and have this conversation for and to
Great.
share that with our audience. So Leslie,
Terrific.
thank you so much for this. Honestly, it's been incredibly insightful, thoughtful. I've learned a lot. Again, like I said, I honestly think when we're done with our conversation today, I'm going to go about my day George Costanza style and try to
Yeah.
flip everything on its head today too, because I think that would just be incredibly fun to see how that would turn out
Yeah,
for me. So,
absolutely.
well, look, that will do it for our conversation today, Leslie. Thank you so much for giving of your time and your expertise and just sharing some of the stories around generative AI, and as well as the book. Which I encourage everybody to pick up. So, Leslie, if folks want to continue the conversation with you, where can they find you online?
Well, I have a website, lesliegrandy.com, and also a Substack. So either of those places work, and
Nice.
everybody's on LinkedIn, but everybody has different opinions about being on LinkedIn. So I offer the other two first.
I am going to take up the offer of the Substack. I didn't realize that, so I will be doing that as well as soon as we're done today. So
Great.
again, thank you for joining me. I look
Thanks for
forward to
having me.
hopefully future conversations with you. This has been so much fun. And for our listeners who are maybe listening in for the first time, let us know what you thought about this conversation. Let us know if there's any other topics you want us to cover on the Everyday PM. You can also subscribe to the podcast on any of your podcasting platforms, as well as drop a comment and let us know what you thought about our conversation today. So that will do it for the Everyday PM. Myself, for Leslie, thank you so much for joining us, everybody. And until next time, take care.